Alright, this is like the shakiest, very unprofessional video I'm shooting, but to give you a hint of where I go to drill and paint my enclosures, I am down in my basement. And so what I'm going to do is show you how I drill enclosures with using a pilot bit and the step bit. But then from there, I'm going to reposition the camera and show you some of the airbrushing stuff I do. This is from where I scored earlier in the video, just putting pilot holes in. And that's on the top and on the front. When using a step bit, what it is there's different measurements on the step bit. When you see me go use this, as I go down, I'm counting how many times it goes into the enclosure. As I get further and further into the enclosure is the measurements I need. So for instance, for like toggle switches and LEDs, we're going to drill in 5 holes. So I'll count 5 times, it gives me a 1/4 inch, and it's perfect for LEDs. Now when I go into 7, that sets us into 5/16. That's for potentiometers. When I go in, I'll be counting to 9. That's for input and output jacks. That puts us at 3/8. And then all the way in is a 1/2 inch, and that's for the foot switch. It's a really nice feature of these step bits and why I really like using them. So let's get back to drilling. All right, so right here, I'm drilling the power, the input and output. I have the lid on the back. That's going to catch all the filings that come off. And I'm going a little bit over on the input and output jacks, about 10 instead of 9 when the depths, just a little over 3/8. Makes things easier when I'm finally doing the wire. Now that I have my pedal enclosure drilled, I take paint. This is just general purpose masking tape. I tape off the whole edge of the enclosure, and I put it on a very, very expensive stand. Literally, it's made out of junk wood I had around the house. That's nailed together, and that is duct tape. I stick the enclosure on there, and that way I don't handle the sides of it and get my fingerprints all over it. And then I'll use this to brush into my homemade spray booth, which I'm going to show you right now. Look at that delicious spray booth. This is a $5 fan or $10 fan I got from Walmart that blasts into air filters that you would use in your furnace. This keeps me from breathing acrylic paint in, and that's what I do here. All right, so here's the surface primer that I use, and I use an Iwata HPCS airbrush. I have a standard air compressor that the air comes out into a step-down valve and a line dryer. And I usually blow primer right around 25 to 30 psi, and I'm just trying to get a nice even coat on there for it. And then there's my Tamiya flat red paint. What you kind of didn't see there is I mix it with water because it is an acrylic, and to thin it down, I make it like the consistency of like milk, basically. And then I'm now spraying a light coat of clear coat with the airbrush, and this is just for a little bit of protection, and it's going to help when I do the final painting on the top of it. Offers just a little bit extra protection so the paint doesn't chip off. All right, so we have finished painting the enclosure. It is dried. It's drilled. Look at that. It's flat red, which I really, really like. And what I love about flat red is it's going to make everything kind of painting and all of the knobs really kind of stand out. So for what I'm going to do next is load in all of the, not all of the hardware, but most of the hardware. So I'm going to get the pots loaded in, the foot switch loaded in. So I kind of have all that here. With the foot switch, I put this locking nut here on the inside. And this little white washer, we throw those in the recycling because they're terrible. So I buy metal washers from stompboxparts.com, and then we put this on and we're going to tighten this up. Now once that's nice and secure, all of my pots, I take off all of the washers and the nuts, and we'll get those popped in there. So what's super easy about these pedal PCB builds is everything's written right on the board itself. So you can really makes the process go pretty quickly. There's not a lot of futzing around. You're not referring back to build docs to try to, oh, was this like this potentiometer, was it B5K or B1K or where does that go or whatever. So yeah. All right, 250, and so you can just look right at the board and go from there. And as you can see, I mean, this came together pretty quickly. This probably would have been a lot faster if I wasn't trying to film and work around cameras and lighting and everything else. But it just did go pretty quickly. Okay. So now that I have the 3 pots in and I have the foot switch in, this is what I like to do, is I like to test fit the board, and then I'm going to get a really good, so here we got our thing in, shoop-a-doop, bop, there we are. So now that I have the board in, or I'm sorry, the pots in, I'm going to test fit the board. And all I'm doing there is just making sure everything fits and nothing's kind of out of line, right? And then I can just kind of set that in there. Now what I'm going to do is put the power jack in. And this is a really neat thing for people who are just starting out. I'm going to show it here. But this is for a foot switch board. So what this does is it takes away it idiot-proofs all the foot switch wiring, which really can throw people off. And by that, there's no jumpers they have to put in with these 3-pole double throw switches. You can just bring 4 wires. So let me get this on here. Now normally I'd use Loctite, but I'm not going to do that right now, and I'll tell you why in a second. But okay, so with the foot switch, now all we have to do is just run 4 wires from this board, from here to here, and then on the outer lugs we got to run this to the jacks, and then we're pretty much done. But what I'm going to do is kind of do this in fast forward mode. I'll put all the wiring in and show kind of how I do it. So normally I Loctite everything, but I'm not going to do that just in case something doesn't work and I want to take it apart. Usually once I'm like ready to have this all painted and good to go, I'll start Loctiting everything so nothing comes apart in, transit or whatever. So wire, and here's how I go for wiring. I just measure this roughly and I cut, especially with using this foot switchboard, I'll just cut 4 pieces, and then I'll strip them and tin them. Now when I say tin them, what I'm going to do is I take my first piece of wire and I'm going to take off just a little bit. Now what I do is I separate that little nub from the wire and I twist it. As I pull that off, I'm twisting that wire to make sure it's all kind of stays together. And then I'll grab my helping hand. That's like this. And then I'll just hit it with the solder, and so it just keeps all those little tiny wires all together so nothing frays and then we have shorted connections or anything. And it makes it super easy. Now the other thing I have to do is I'm going to have to wire the positive, which let's get that right up there. So I'm going to have to come off with the positive and the negative to the power jack. I'm also going to have to throw in some wires for the LED. And yeah, so what I'm going to do is just start kind of cracking away on this. I'll keep the cameras rolling. Like I said, we'll fast forward through all this so it's not so mundane. Oh, one thing I should mention, 22 gauge stranded wire. Some people I know like to use the solid core wire because it bends and you can make everything look super nice and particular and pretty. The one thing I don't like about that stuff, which it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you can use it, it's just as fine, but that wire might eventually break and then your pedal's just not going to work. Whereas a stranded wire, even if one of those little strands breaks, it's still going to have enough connectivity between all the other wires. So you're fine there. So that's just my thing. And I bought this Stomp Box parts, 1,000 feet for 25 bucks. You can get wire from Tata, you can get wire from anyone. I used to buy it from a local hardware or electronic supply house. That was pretty decent. So, yeah. I'll shut up and get to work here, huh? And as you can see on my desk here, I keep different wires that I cut, kind of set aside so I know what they're going to eventually go for. That way I'm not confusing myself. I always do this. I try to wire kind of everything at once. Just makes it a little bit easier for me.
Just to further expand on that, I'm tinning all the wires. What I do is I kind of lay them out on a piece of paper about where they're going to go on the board. And I just want to make sure that everything's in the board, tinned, sticking out, and it just kind of helps the process along. It makes everything a little bit smoother and easier, as easy as pedal building can be, especially for a new beginner. And I'm really struggling with that last one. I was having problems with the tip. It's just monkeying around forever with it.
I'm going to pause right there. That last one was pretty hard to get in. These pads on here are always really tiny on the pedalpcb.com boards. If you're wondering what I was doing. Like, hey, what's that idiot doing? Monkeying around all the time, huh? That stupid bastard.
Just to get a glimpse into what my life is like, usually I spend my pedal building time making voices and acting like an idiot. That's just who I am as a person. A goofball. So continuing with the build, though, I'm hitting all the last of the wires. I'm stripping them, and I'm tinning them and getting them ready for the final putting in
all
the
right.
boards.
LED 101. This is an LED. The long leg here is the positive. Let's see, it's so hard to do this in reverse and everything with the camera. Long leg is the positive, short leg's the negative. Now I don't have really long, like some of the LEDs have really long legs on them. These aren't. So I have to wire it out a little bit to add this on. So what I'll do is I'll try to show this here, is I will take the wires and I will curl them with my needle nose pliers like such, after they've been tinned, of course, like that. Then what I'll do is kind of shove the LED legs in there. Hopefully you can see that. See how they're like hooped? I'll put the LED in there like such and kind of hang it. And I'll stagger them a little bit too, so when I solder they don't end up touching. And then it just will sit really nicely inside of the bezel that I'll use, which I really like, these clear plastic little things. They're pretty nice. It's better than looking at the top of an LED, you know?
I've always hated those big LED bezels, by the way. I love those little plastic ones.
So, pull my hands out of the way, and as you can see, it's how nice that and neat that kind of turned out to be. Then I'll trim the excess. And I've popped a few LEDs making pedals, so I always try to keep that in mind. Now what I'll do here is with the plastic bezels, I'll just slide that bad boy in. So now here's how we set. We got the board, we got the flying leads coming off of it. What we're going to do is just kind of slowly sandwich everything in there. And as you can see, my pots are kind of wiggling around. Now we got the board shoved on top there. What I'll do is I kind of like tack solder just one leg in. I'll maybe do the middle leg. Now the reason I do that, and I'll show that here, is, I'm sorry about all the bad lighting. But I'll tack solder, and then that way I can move around the pots a little bit if I want to get them maybe more centered on here. So if things need to get adjusted, we can do so.
And about this time, I still don't realize that I haven't put in the ground wires for the enclosure.
Now we'll slide this right over our foot switch. Now I'm going to start cranking down the foot switch here. With this, I'm just holding the back of the foot switch and using that 14mm socket, just going to turn it finger tight. Now some people use those rocket sockets, which there's nothing wrong with those. They're really nice. But I have 1.5 million sockets laying around here from fixing everything else in this house, so we'll go that route. And then from here, I'm going to push this LED down. There we go. That's in place. And now we have... I'm just sliding the wires for the power in here. And you know what it looks like I forgot to do? I forgot to ground the board. Son of a gun.
Yep, building pedals for about 15 years and I still make mistakes. And it's usually little stuff like this that I forget. But it was no big deal. I didn't have the power soldered in, so I was able to just pull the whole board out, put in a couple extra ground wires, and slide everything back together. And it just ended up adding a little bit more time to the build. But it's no big deal. I kind of like showing these mistakes for new people. You know, I don't think any of us ever get it right the first time, no matter how experienced we are, right?
So as you can see here, we have the board in, and we just have the ground wires to connect to the input and output jacks. Now, the input and output jacks, realistically, we only need to have one ground hooked up because it's going to be using the whole enclosure as a ground, but I'm going to do both just so everyone can see. Your ground is this sleeve right here. It's called the sleeve of the jack, and that's what connects the outside of the jack to the ground, which grounds the board and the whole kit and caboodle. And then the wires that come off this foot switch here, as we can see, these long wires are going to go to the tip, which is this lug here, which actually connects to this part. Now, what we can do to kind of show all this is using a multimeter that has a function that's like a signal. So for my multimeter here, that never wants to turn on properly, it's got this connectivity. So when we turn these together, it whistles or beeps. So you can see if we put the one probe here and one probe here, it goes off. Now if we put one here and one here, it's showing that we have ground through both of these, right? The same is going to be once we attach one of these grounds to the board, everything's going to be grounded. But like I said, we'll do both just to do it, okay? Now, when it comes to doing the final wiring, I don't get too particular. You see a lot of people who will and I've done it, don't get me wrong. I've done it where they'll have right angles and everything. What I try to do is just make sure that wherever if I'm gonna put a jack in there, and I will have I always keep like a jack around to make sure that when I put the jack in, I'm not going to hit any wires. That's the only thing I'm looking for here. So as you can see, I put the jack in, and I will try to route my ground wire over here and then keep my input wire here. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and get those wired up, and then I will do this board, finish soldering in the board, because as of right now, it's free floating. It's not attached. And then I will put the knobs on, and we'll do a little bit of painting just to label everything, and then we can go into testing it. So I'm gonna get crack-a-lackin'.
And this is just the final wiring of the board. I'm making sure I get the grounds to the input and output jacks, and then wiring the input and output jacks to the foot switch. And this is kind of like the final last little things that we get to do on the external wiring.
Okay, so we are all wired up. Now, as you can tell from here, if you can see that, I only have the couple solder blobs on the potentiometers and nothing on the jack. There's a reason for that. As I stated earlier, I just put one blob on there and I can move the pots around to make sure everything, you know, lines up and looks really cool, right? Because the whole reason is we got to look cool. Now, what I like to do is your foot switch cannot take a lot of heat, okay? And I learned this the hard way a lot when I first started building pedals back before, you know, these breakout boards were kind of a common thing. I melted, you know, probably 5 foot switches at least. If you apply too much heat to these, what'll end up happening is let me try to see if I can get this. See all this like red around here and how it's kind of, that's in a like basically an epoxy type thing. And if you heat these up too much, these pins will just pull right out. So what I like to do, and especially when I'm using these breakout boards, because you can get really excited, hey, I'm almost done, I can just solder in these last 9 pins and be done. I'll solder one at a time, let it cool, go to the next one, maybe on the opposite side of the switch so the heat's not kind of bunched around the 1 foot switch part. So I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to go right here to this upper pin and just hit it with the iron, feed it some solder. There we go. Now we're going to let that cool. While that's cooling and hardening, I'm going to go over here and do a pot. So we'll get this bias sundial pot in. Okay. There. Now we're going to come back. I'm going to hit the outer opposite end. And again, you just need to, there we go. So, and in doing so now there's no risk on that switch. We're going to get them done, and it's never going to get to the temperatures where we'll melt that epoxy. And they make switches, like if you go to Love My Switches, which I highly recommend, I've noticed he has some like switches that are maybe meant for higher temps. And maybe I saw them on Small Bear, but they do make them that are meant, but if you just be patient, it's not a big deal really. But again, when I was younger and building pedals and never patient, I melted a lot of foot switches. Okay, so here we go. We got our volume all put in. Now, one thing I should note here that I didn't kind of talk about is with a fuzz face, which is essentially what this is a fuzz face. You'll see on almost every single fuzz face that's ever been made, or the variants, you know, they're going to call for an A250 pot for volume. The volumes sometimes change, but 9 times out of 10, your fuzz pot is a B1K. Now, and I'm going to draw this here real quick. So there's A pots, B pots, C pots. Oop. There's W pots, which I'm not going to get into, but there are, so you see them. An A pot has a taper that's like this, a B's like this, and a C's like this. So this is, you know, 0 and this is 10. Okay. Now, for a fuzz pot, when you start at 0 and go to 10, on most fuzzes, it doesn't do really anything till about 8, right? It doesn't. I mean, and anyone who says otherwise has never played a fuzz face. So, what I like to do, and I didn't mention it, but I'm going to mention it now, is I put a C1K pot here on this fuzz, because I'm going to start seeing more shades of fuzz right about here. And then as I go from here to here, we're going to just have a little bit more variation in the theme. That's all it is. And I wasn't going to say anything earlier, but I'm sure maybe someone might catch it. So there's your different pots. So now let's finish up this thing, and I'm going to put some knobs on and do some lettering. And kind of show what I do for lettering. Now, as I mentioned before with painting, I use an airbrush for this to get this flat red. And as you can see, there's no gloss on it, and I love that about this. Again, I am kind of not getting a lot of light in this room for some reason, but at any rate, it's flat. And what's really cool is when I do the lettering with white and black, and then I have this color knob on there, it's really gonna pop. It's really gonna be like something pretty nice. So, again, that was a nice way to detract from heating up more lugs on my foot switch. So we have 4 left here.
And just in brief, what I'm kind of talking about here as I'm wiring the switch is the paints I use. I use Tester's acrylic and Model Master's acrylic and Tamiya.
So, okay, we're done. We have everything wired up on the inside. And as you can see, the jack's in, everything's done. It's cool. We have all this taken care of. And I'll show you that test, the ground thing again, just so you can see it. We're gonna put one of our probes into the enclosure there, and we can hit the ground thing here, right? Hit it here. So we're getting ground everywhere, which is really nice. Now, we also can do is, since this is a mechanical switch, so we're getting from in to the out, and now we're into the effect, but there's no power to it, so we're not going to get anything. So there you go. Little neat thing there to check out. Okay, so next up is knobbing it, and then painting, which I'm not quite set up to paint, but I will knob it. So what I like to do is I always turn all my knobs, these all the way over here, little thing, little screwdriver, and we'll just do this guy and this guy. I've never found a method to get this right the first time. Like, it's real rare. It's really rare. If anyone has one, shoot it my way, because never in the history of building pedals have I ever gotten it right the first time. Okay, so there we are. We have a fully built pedal. Now, what we need to do is make sure we get the LED to turn on. That's my first check when it comes to building pedals. Does it light up? Because then I can tell right there, if I have power to it and the LED's not turning on, there's something wrong. But look at that. We're already doing really well. So I'm gonna get set up to do some hand painting so you guys can see it. I'm gonna try to adjust my camera again and hopefully get a better view so we can see what I do here. And then we'll start filming again.